I saw a strange man leave my wife at home. A dark car, closed windows, low lights. I was standing on the corner, watching, hoping that my mind was playing some trick, that there was a logical explanation for what my eyes were seeing. But when the car door opened and my wife got out, fixing her hair and smiling at the driver before closing the door, my stomach sank. He wasn't an app driver, he wasn't a coworker, he wasn't a friend. It was a man. A man who looked at her the way I used to, a man she treated with frightening familiarity. And when he drove away, accelerating slowly, almost as if he didn't want to attract attention, I did the only thing my mind screaming with rage and despair could think of, I followed him. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, my heart was beating so hard that I could feel it in my neck. I kept a safe distance, trying to control my breathing, trying not to be overwhelmed by hypotheses and assumptions. But every kilometer that car covered pushed me closer to the truth. He wasn't just taking my wife home. They hadn't just said goodbye after a random night. That man was leaving a romantic date with her. A dinner, maybe a walk, maybe even more than that. My chest burned at the thought of what could have happened a few hours before that moment. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling a lump form in my throat, my vision blurring for a moment. It couldn't be. Not with her. The car entered a neighborhood that I didn't immediately recognize, wide streets, well-kept houses, a discreet and quiet place. He parked and stood there for a few seconds, as if making sure he wasn't followed. Little did he know that betrayal has eyes, and mine were fixed on him. I saw him get out of the car, adjust his jacket and enter the house. My chest rose and fell rapidly. My hands were shaking. I needed to know who he was. I needed to know where I was standing. With careful steps, I approached. Each step seemed to echo in my head like a war drum, a warning that I was about to face something that would change my life forever. What I found was not what I expected. He wasn't just any young man, an insignificant stranger. It wasn't just a man who took advantage of a married woman's weakness. This was someone who should have known better. Someone who had as much to lose as I did. My blood ran cold. Anger pulsed like boiling lava in my veins. The air felt like it had been sucked out of my lungs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to punch something. I wanted to enter that house and destroy everything around me. But I didn't do anything. I just stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling the crushing weight of the truth come crashing down on me. I returned home in silence. My mind in chaos, my breathing short, the images of that romantic dinner haunting me. I could see them in my head, laughing, toasting, exchanging knowing glances, hands touching under the table. I could imagine every word whispered, every lie told to keep me in the dark. But now I saw it. Now I knew. And I couldn't keep living that lie. I couldn't share my house, my bed, my life with someone who looked me in the eye and lied without hesitation. She was on the couch when I walked in. The smile disappeared as soon as he saw my face. Something inside her knew that I knew. That the veil of lies had been torn away. What it was? His voice sounded cautious, as if he feared my answer. I looked at her for a long second, feeling my heart shatter. I loved her. I loved her with everything I had. I built a life alongside her, trusting, believing, giving myself completely. And all of this had been reduced to ashes. Do you really want me to answer? My voice came out cold, without emotion. She blinked a few times, her breathing quickened. She tried to hold my hand, but I backed away. What do you know? His tone was now hesitant, full of fear. The irony hit me hard. She wanted to know how much I knew, not what I had done. I wanted to measure the depth of his betrayal through my eyes. I know enough. My voice was a razor's edge. And that's all that matters. She turned pale, her mouth opened as if she wanted to argue, justify herself, lie once again. But there was no more room for that. Did you follow him? His voice broke at the end. I didn't respond. I just watched her. Because now everything was clear. The regret in his eyes wasn't about betraying me. It was because she was caught. And as she desperately searched for some excuse, some way out, I knew. Our marriage was over. I didn't need to hear his words. I didn't need any more proof. The truth had already been revealed. But what I still didn't know, what I couldn't have predicted, was what would happen next. Because sometimes cheating doesn't just destroy a marriage. She drags everything around into the abyss. And what I was about to discover would make all that pain even more unbearable. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal is not glorified, on the contrary, we show the devastating price it takes. The stories are fictional, but the feelings are real. Betrayal destroys, corrodes and changes lives forever. Each narrative is a reminder that trust is precious and, when broken, can have irreversible consequences. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is a shocking, intense story full of twists and turns. Let the cruel truth of betrayal begin. Michael has always been a practical man. Disciplined, organized, with a sense of responsibility that bordered on obsession. He worked at a prestigious financial consultancy, a position that required his almost constant attention, but he never let the work completely consume him. His priority has always been his family. He loved Emily with the same intensity as when he met her years ago, when they were still young and full of dreams that seemed unattainable. Together, they built a solid life, based on respect, affection and a comfortable routine that he believed was enough to keep them together. Their marriage was not one of outbursts of exaggerated passion, but rather a comforting stability, the kind of relationship that Michael had always valued and was proud of. Emily, on the other hand, was a woman with a sweet personality but a restless spirit. Unlike her husband, who felt safe within the well-established boundaries of predictability, she longed for new things, small surprises that broke the monotony of everyday life. Not that he didn't love Michael. She loved him, of course she did. He was a man of integrity, a good husband, a faithful and dedicated partner. But sometimes Emily felt like she had lost herself in the role of perfect wife. Marriage brought comfort, but it also silenced certain parts of her that, deep down, still wanted more. Small moments of spontaneity, raw emotions, something that took her off the autopilot that, increasingly, seemed to guide her life. The house where they lived reflected this dynamic between them. Michael made a point of keeping everything impeccable, tidy, predictable. Each piece of furniture had its exact place, each decoration was chosen based on functionality. Emily tried, from time to time, to break this rigidity with something lighter, a different plant, a new color for the living room wall, aromatic candles that he frequently removed so that they wouldn't disturb the organization. The atmosphere was cozy, but carried the weight of a well-established routine, of a marriage that, despite being solid, no longer had the shine it once had. Their days followed a pattern. Michael left early for work, often without breakfast, leaving a quick kiss on his wife's forehead and murmuring an almost automatic, "I love you." Emily would stay at home for a few hours before going to the publishing house where she worked as a proofreader, a job she liked but that didn't fulfill her completely. When he returned home, he would prepare dinner, and then Michael would arrive, exhausted, but always with a smile, ready to tell him about his day. They ate together, watched a movie or read before bed, a habit they had cultivated since the early years of their marriage. Sometimes they talked about simple things, plans for the future, small changes in the house, trips they could take. But lately, Emily felt like those conversations were just words, rehearsed script that they repeated without realizing that, in fact, they were growing further and further apart. Weekends were predictable. Dinners at well-known restaurants, meetings with friendly couples, morning walks through the park, a car ride to his parents' house in the country. They were pleasant moments, of course, but for Emily, they were increasingly repetitive. No matter how much she tried to show it, Michael never seemed to notice her uneasiness. For him, if they were together, then everything was fine. There were never explosive fights, serious disagreements, cruel words spoken in the heat of the moment. The problem between them was silent, a gradual separation that neither of them dared to name. Emily began to notice her own behavior changing. Sometimes she found herself distracted, staring into space, wondering if she was being ungrateful because she felt like something was missing. She looked at her husband and tried to convince herself that he was exaggerating, that this was just a passing moment, a phase. But this phase seemed to go on longer than it should have. Small details began to bother him more than before. Michael's way too methodical, his predictability, the way he never questioned anything, how he accepted each day without wanting anything more than what they already had. Emily wanted to feel that she was still desired, that there was something new to be discovered, that there was still mystery between them. But routine slowly crushed these hopes. One night, after a too-quiet dinner, Emily tried to bring up a different topic. He asked if Michael didn't think they were stuck in a constant repetition, if he didn't miss something more. He smiled, not quite understanding. "But we're fine, aren't we? Do you want to travel? We can plan something for next month." Emily sighed. That wasn't what she was talking about. She wanted him to see what was between the lines, but Michael had always been a man of straight answers. He never knew how to interpret silences. She lay down next to him that night and stared at the ceiling as she listened to her husband's calm breathing beside her. A good man, a trustworthy man, a man who loved her. But was love alone enough? Emily turned to the side, trying to shake those thoughts away, but they persisted, echoing in her mind like a silent warning. The next morning, Michael left for work as usual, kissed her forehead and wished her a good day. Emily remained in bed for a few minutes, looking at the ceiling, feeling a weight in her chest that she couldn't explain. She got up, took a long shower, got dressed and left for work. The day continued its normal course, and when she returned home, the uneasy feeling was still there, like an invisible shadow that followed her wherever she went. The phone rang. It was a friend, asking if she wanted to go out to dinner. Emily hesitated for a moment, looking at her watch. Michael wouldn't arrive until later. Maybe a different dinner would be a good idea. She accepted the invitation, got ready more carefully than usual and left. The restaurant was elegant, the food was good, the conversations were light, but something about Emily still seemed out of place. She looked around, observed the other couples, and wondered if any of them felt what she felt. If any of them had ever wondered if they were just going with the flow, without questioning where they were going. When the night ended, she said goodbye to her friends and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the cold wind against her skin. There was something inside her that needed to be filled, but she didn't know what yet. When he got home, Michael was already asleep. She lay down next to him and, for a brief moment, she felt like waking him up, telling him everything she was feeling, asking him if he really saw her or if he just believed everything was fine because he never looked deep enough. But in the end, she just closed her eyes and let the tiredness take her. Tomorrow would come as always, and maybe, just maybe, things would go back to normal. But what Emily didn't know was that that restlessness wouldn't go away. That night, that feeling, that desire for something more, would not be forgotten so easily. And that, without realizing it, she had already taken the first step towards something that would change her life forever. The days followed their normal course, or at least that was how Michael perceived them. The work continued to be demanding, numbers needed to be analyzed, customers served, goals achieved. He threw himself into the routine with the same discipline as always, believing that this was enough to keep everything in place. But Emily, on the other hand, felt each day dragged by like an uncomfortable reminder that something inside her was changing. The restlessness that previously came and went like a breeze was now a constant weight, a presence that lodged itself in her chest and prevented her from breathing properly. Small details began to catch her attention more than before. The silence at dinner seemed longer, the good morning kiss colder, the conversations shallower. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was just a passing moment, that any marriage goes through phases like this. But the truth, the one she avoided admitting even to herself, was that she no longer saw Michael in the same way. He was a good, reliable, stable man. But the stability that once brought him security now felt like an invisible prison. The days turned into weeks and, little by little, Emily began to allow herself certain freedoms. A long coffee after work, a lunch without telling your husband, a message not answered immediately. Small things, details that might go unnoticed, but that, for her, meant something. A test. A silent game against herself to see how far she could go without anyone noticing. But someone noticed. Someone who was there without her even realizing it. That chance meeting, that long look, that conversation that started innocently and somehow became more intimate than it should have been. Her world expanded in ways she hadn't expected, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was alive again. The attraction appeared in a subtle, discreet way, as if it didn't want to impose itself immediately. At first, it was just trivial exchanges of words, looks that lasted a second longer than necessary. Then came the accidental touches, the messages that started about work and ended with something more personal. Emily tried to convince herself that she wasn't doing anything wrong, that it was nothing more than a friendship, that she needed that new thing to fill a harmless void. But the line between what was permitted and what was prohibited began to blur so quickly that, before he realized it, he was already on the other side. The first time they went out together was completely spontaneous. An invitation made without much pretension, any excuse to extend the conversation beyond the work environment. A dinner in a discreet restaurant, a table far away, a wine chosen without much concern. The conversation flowed with a naturalness she hadn't felt in years. They laughed, they talked about everything and nothing, about desires, about dreams, about things she didn't even remember she liked. And then, at the end of the night, the goodbye happened with a subtle touch, fingers that lingered longer than they should have, eyes that couldn't look away. Emily's heart was beating fast, but it wasn't fear. It was excitement. An adrenaline that took over her body and made her feel as if she had woken up from a sleep that was too long. After that, everything intensified. The messages became daily, the meetings frequent. Little lies became part of his routine, justifications that Michael accepted without question. Marriage was already too safe a territory for him to suspect anything. Emily knew this, and this certainty made her feel even more free to continue. But at the same time, a silent guilt accompanied her. In the days following each encounter, she tried to make it up to Michael, tried to convince herself that she still loved him, that this was just a temporary escape. But the truth was that the betrayal was taking root more and more, and she no longer knew how to get out of it. Michael, in turn, did not see the changes clearly. He noticed that Emily was more radiant, that she smiled more, that sometimes she got lost in thought during dinner. But his mind never entertained the hypothesis it should have. He attributed it to a good time at work, perhaps to some change in routine that made her feel lighter. And even when Emily started going out more, arriving later, getting ready more carefully than before, he didn't ask questions. Because, in his mind, there was no reason for doubt. After all, they were married, they were happy, they had a solid life. Emily loved him. And that was enough. The betrayal did not come as a great shock, it was not an isolated and explosive event. It was a process, a succession of choices that, little by little, took Emily out of the marriage and led her into something she could no longer control. And then, on a night that should have been like any other, Michael saw the thing that would change everything. He arrived home a little earlier than usual, expecting to find Emily cooking dinner or reading on the couch, like she always did. But the house was silent. He felt a tightness in his chest, a feeling he couldn't explain. He walked to the living room, dropped the folder on the table and looked around. Her coat wasn't hanging in its usual place. The keys were not on the table. And then, on instinct, he walked to the window and looked out onto the street. The unknown car was there. The headlights were off, the engine was still running, as if waiting to leave at any moment. He didn't recognize that vehicle, but what made his stomach sink was not the car itself, but the sight of the door opening and Emily getting out, fixing her hair, smiling. The chill down my spine was immediate. The heart raced. Michael remained still, watching as she leaned slightly into the car, saying something he couldn't hear. The man inside the vehicle replied something and then the door closed. The car accelerated slowly, without rushing, without suspecting that it was being observed. Michael didn't think. He just took the keys and left. His mind pulsed with questions, but deep down, he already knew the answers. My chest was burning, my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. He followed, keeping a safe distance, his gaze fixed on the car ahead. Every kilometer traveled was like a nail driven into his flesh. Emily had been inside. And he needed to know where that man was going. He parked on a lightly traveled street, watching as the man got out of the car and entered a house. The air felt like it had been sucked out of Michael's lungs. He wanted to explode, wanted to charge forward, confront him right there. But the shock kept him pinned in the car seat, unable to move a muscle. He needed to understand who this man was. And I needed to know how long this had been happening. Betrayal was before him. Clara. Cruel. No room for doubt. But what Michael still didn't know was that this man wasn't just a stranger. That betrayal hid something much bigger, something he would never have imagined. And what he was about to discover would make all the pain even more unbearable. Michael remained motionless inside the car, his eyes fixed on the house where that man had entered. His chest rose and fell irregularly, as if breathing had become an impossible effort. His heart hammered inside his chest, a frantic beat of anger, disbelief and pain. He was still trying to hold on to some logical explanation, something that made sense, something that said it wasn't what it seemed to be. But the truth was already in front of him, naked and cruel. Emily had betrayed him. And now he was there, in front of that man's house, trying to understand what to do next. Anger burned through his veins as his fingers tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He had never felt so helpless in his life. Everything he built, all the years dedicated to marriage, to family, to the stability he always believed was enough, were now just ashes scattered in the wind. Betrayal had settled in the middle of his story like a plague, corroding everything he thought was solid. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. But then the door to the house opened again. The man left. And Michael saw his face. The shock was so great that he almost couldn't breathe. His world spun violently, as if reality had just shattered right before his eyes. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't just any young man, a coworker, an opportunistic adventurer. It was Ethan. Claire's husband. Emily's best friend. Michael's mind descended into chaos, trying to piece together the dirty, devastating puzzle. Ethan and Claire had been married for years. They were the couple who always accompanied them on dinners, trips, weekend get-togethers. How many times had he and Ethan toasted together, talked about their wives, exchanged marriage advice? How many times did he sit next to that man, laugh at his jokes, trust him? Michael's stomach turned, and he felt bile rise in his throat. Emily was sleeping with her best friend's husband. The betrayal wasn't just against him. It was against Claire. It was against all the trust that existed between the four of them. The need to confront everything exploded within him. Without thinking twice, he got out of the car, slamming the door hard, and walked quickly towards Ethan, who was still playing with his cell phone, distracted, not noticing the storm that was approaching. Michael stood before him, his eyes boiling with hatred, his entire body rigid. Ethan looked up and froze. "Michael? What are you doing here?" His voice was hesitant, filled with surprise and, within seconds, growing suspicion. But Michael didn't hesitate. He took a step forward and, before he could stop the impulse, his hand closed on Ethan's shirt collar, pulling him close with a force that made the other stagger. "How could you? How did you have the audacity to do this?" Ethan's eyes widened, his lips parting in a surprised gasp, but it didn't take long for realization to fill his face. The silence between them was short, but dense. An instant where the truth hovered between the two like a punch in the stomach. "Michael, listen to me, it's not what you're thinking." Michael's laugh was dry, bitter, filled with a hatred he didn't even know he was capable of feeling. "Oh, no. So tell me, Ethan, what the hell is this?" "Because I saw my wife get out of her car. I saw the way she smiled at you. I've seen enough to know that you two are disgusting traitors." Ethan took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a brief moment and, when he opened them again, his face was filled with a mix of shame and despair. He ran his hand over his face, as if trying to find the right words, but deep down he knew that no amount of justification would be enough. "Michael, this was never planned, it was never something I wanted to happen. Do you want me to feel sorry? Do you want me to understand? It's not that." Michael pushed him away, his voice coming out sharp. "You were my friend. You were Emily's best friend's husband. You were someone I trusted. How the hell did you get involved with my wife?" Ethan lowered his head, his shoulders slumped as if carrying the weight of guilt. "I don't know when it started exactly. We got closer and started talking, to talk. Is this what you call cheating on your spouse now?" Ethan sighed, seeming to know that anything he said would only make the situation worse. "I'm in love with her, Michael." Those words hit Michael like a physical blow. He felt as if all the air had been knocked out of his lungs. His chest tightened, and a metallic taste of bile rose in his throat. "You dare say that to me? You dare admit this to my face?" Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, as if he expected a punch, as if he knew he deserved one. "I know this is unforgivable. I know I made a mistake. But..." Michael didn't want to hear any more. There were no explanations, no reasons, no justifications that erased the fact that he had been betrayed. Not just for his wife, but for a man he considered a friend. He backed away, his fists clenched, his eyes burning. His mind was screaming at the top of his lungs for him to do something, anything. But instead, he turned his back and walked away, leaving Ethan there, standing there, broken in his own shame. On the way home, Michael felt each heartbeat like a blade being plunged into his chest. The anger, the pain, the humiliation, everything was mixed together in an unbearable whirlwind. He wanted to confront Emily, he wanted to demand answers, he wanted to understand how she had the courage to destroy everything they had built. But at the same time, another question began to arise within him. If Ethan and Emily were cheating on Claire and him, then what did Claire know about all this? And, more than that, if Claire found out, what would her reaction be? Michael drove aimlessly, his mind racing, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel so hard. The revelation still beat in his head like a war drum. He couldn't digest it. The weight of what he had discovered was overwhelming. Emily hadn't just betrayed him. She had done this with Ethan, the man who, for years, sat at her table, shared laughs, confided in problems. It was a level of betrayal that went beyond what he could imagine. And Claire? What did Claire know about this? Did she suspect it? Was she being deceived in the same way? Or, worse, did she know and simply accept it? He picked up his cell phone, his fingers shaking, and dialed Claire's number without even thinking. I didn't know what I expected to find on the other end of the line, but I needed to hear his voice. The phone rang a few times before being answered. "Michael? It is good too. Your voice sounds strange." He swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling with heavy breathing. "Where are you?" "At home, why?" "I need to talk to you. Now." The silence on the other side was short, but filled with hesitation. "Did something happen? Just tell me I can come over there." "Of course, Michael. You can come." He hung up without saying anything else and turned the car toward Claire's house. The path seemed longer than normal, each red traffic light was a challenge to his limit of patience. When he finally parked in front of her house, it took him a few seconds before getting out of the car. His body was tense, as if every muscle was about to explode. Claire opened the door before he could even knock. Her face carried sincere concern, her eyes attentive, searching him for some clue as to what brought him there so abruptly. "Come in, please." Michael walked in, smelling the familiar smell of coffee mixed with the discreet floral perfume that Claire always wore. The atmosphere was cozy, but there was something in the air, a feeling that, in a few minutes, everything in that place would be contaminated by something much darker. "What happened?" she asked, crossing her arms, her eyes fixed on him. Michael took a deep breath, trying to find the best way to say it, but he realized there was no right way to tell such a devastating truth. "I found out that Emily is cheating on me." Claire's eyes widened, and she brought her hand to her mouth for a moment, as if trying to contain the impact of those words. "My God. Michael, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." He clenched his jaw, looking away for a brief moment before finally saying what really mattered. "It's with Ethan." Claire's body instantly stiffened. Her face drained of color, and she blinked several times, as if trying to process what she had just heard. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The silence between the two was dense, filled with an almost suffocating tension. "It can't be." Her voice came out in a thread, a faint whisper that seemed to beg for it to be a lie. "I saw them. I followed his car after he dropped Emily off at home." Claire stumbled back slightly and put her hands to her head, as if she wanted to hold on to anything that would keep her from collapsing right there. How could this be happening? Michael felt a tightness in his chest when he saw her like that. Claire was a strong, independent, self-assured woman. Watching her break in the face of that truth was like watching something sacred being destroyed before her eyes. "How long has this been going on?" Michael shook his head. "I don't know. But the way it all happened, the way they were. This is not recent." Claire sat on the sofa, her shaking hands holding her face. "My God. I never suspected. I've never seen anything that made me imagine." Michael felt a lump in his throat. "Me either." The silence between the two was long. Claire seemed to fight the emotions that consumed her. She took a few deep breaths, but her eyes were watery, her face pale. "How do you want to deal with this?" Michael didn't respond right away. His mind was buzzing with thousands of possibilities. He wanted to confront Emily, wanted to make her feel a tenth of the pain he was feeling. But now, seeing Claire there, destroyed by the same betrayal that hurt him, he realized that there was something even bigger at stake. "I need proof. I need her to admit this. That there is no way to escape." Claire nodded slowly, her expression hardening. "Me too." For a moment, they just stared at each other. Two betrayed, two people who, in a matter of minutes, saw their marriages fall apart. And then? What do we do? Michael took a deep breath. "We caught them together." Claire nodded, wiping away a lone tear that escaped from the corner of her eye. "Let's end this the right way." Michael didn't know what the future held, but at that moment, he was sure of one thing: Emily and Ethan would pay for what they did. Michael and Claire sat in silence for a long time. The room, once a comfortable refuge, now seemed small, suffocating, weighed down by the weight of the betrayal that the two had just discovered. Neither of them were sure how to go from there. The pain was still raw, pulsing, and the anger wavered between explosive and silent. Claire ran her hands over her face, breathing deeply, trying to find some semblance of control within the turmoil that was forming inside her. Michael observed her every little gesture and recognized there the same feeling of helplessness that consumed him. They weren't just a betrayed couple. They were two people who had their stories torn apart by those they trusted most. The idea of catching the two of them together had settled into their minds as an inevitable necessity. Michael didn't want to allow Emily to continue living a lie. He wanted to see her trapped, with no way out, no excuses. Claire felt the same way about Ethan. The initial shock had turned into something colder, more calculating. They needed proof. An impulsive, emotionally charged confrontation was not enough. They needed to arm themselves with the truth, expose every detail, destroy any possibility of denial. What if we schedule something? A date, a dinner? Claire suggested, her voice still shaky but full of determination. Something that forces them to betray themselves in front of us. Michael pondered the idea. It was risky, but it made sense. Emily and Ethan were too confident to notice any suspicions. They lived in the comfort of lies, believing they were safe, protected by routine, by the blind trust that both Michael and Claire placed in them. "I can suggest a couple's dinner," he murmured, his eyes fixed on space. "Somewhere they don't expect." Claire nodded slowly, processing the possibilities. "And when they give any sign, when they look at each other the way I saw them today, we caught them." The two stared at each other for a moment, the tension in the air almost palpable. It was a plan, but, above all, it was the only way to not allow that betrayal to continue. Claire picked up the phone, took a deep breath, and dialed Ethan's number. Michael watched as she pressed the device to her ear, trying to control the emotions that were overflowing with every second. "Hi, love," his voice sounded on the other end of the line, casual, calm, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break. "Hi. I was thinking about going out for the weekend. You, me, Michael and Emily. It's been a while since we had dinner together, right?" Michael felt his stomach drop as he heard the words come out of Claire's mouth in such a calculated way, as if she weren't seconds away from exploding. The silence on the other side was short, but full of hesitation. Well, yes, of course. What place do you have in mind?" She threw out some name, a restaurant the four of them had been to before. Ethan agreed, without suspecting anything, and the connection ended within a few seconds. When Claire hung up, she let out a breath she didn't even realize she was holding. Michael took out his own cell phone and sent a message to Emily. "Dinner with Claire and Ethan on Saturday. We can go together." The answer came almost instantly. "Of course. It'll be great. It's been a while since the four of us went out." The venom embedded in that sentence made Michael grind his teeth. How could she lie so easily? How could he smile while stabbing his marriage in the back? He clutched the cell phone in his hand, feeling a wave of hatred rising in his chest. But he forced himself to breathe. It wasn't time yet. The days that followed were tortuous. Michael and Claire exchanged messages frequently, but avoided talking openly about how they felt. Both were trapped within their own internal battles, digesting the pain however they could. Michael still slept next to Emily, still saw her go about her routine, still act as if everything was perfectly normal. Her every smile, every casual touch, every word spoken with that softness he always loved, now felt like a cruel blow. He wanted to scream. I wanted to ask how she did it. But he held back every impulse, because he needed to see how far she would go. Saturday arrived. Michael and Emily went together, as planned. In the car, she was talking animatedly about something trivial, maybe about a new idea for the publisher, maybe about a book she was reviewing. He barely listened. His mind was caught up in the farce unfolding before him. Claire and Ethan were already at the restaurant when they arrived. The couple welcomed them with smiles, hugs, and kind words. The performance began. Michael watched Emily and Ethan's every move. They tried to behave normally, but there was something there. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The way Emily's eyes darted away when they met Ethan's. The way Ethan smiled a little more softly than he should have. Michael felt the anger growing, feeding on it. Claire also noticed. His fingers were dug into the tablecloth, his smile frozen in an expression that seemed on the verge of collapse. "So, how's work going?" Michael asked, and his own voice sounded strange to him. Ethan smiled, picking up the wine glass. "Same as always. Lots of meetings, difficult clients, you know how it goes." Michael nodded, keeping his gaze steady. "I imagine it must be tiring." Emily laughed softly. "Ah, but Ethan knows how to deal with it very well." Claire blinked, her breathing barely audible. "Oh yes. I'm sure he handles certain pressures very well." Ethan paused for a second, eyes darkening. "What do you mean by that?" Claire set the glass down on the table slowly, each movement calculated. "I mean exactly that. You know, don't you? How you deal with pressure." Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. Emily looked at Claire, a nervous smile on her lips. "Claire, are you okay?" "Better than ever," Claire replied, her gaze now fixed on Ethan. The tension at the table became unbearable. A silence took over the space, a heavy silence, loaded with the truth that was about to be spit out in the middle of that dinner. Claire took a deep breath, as if preparing for the final blow. Michael didn't blink. His heart pounded. "You know, Ethan," her voice was low, but sharp as a blade. "When exactly were you going to tell me that you're sleeping with your friend's wife?" The impact was instantaneous. Emily paled, her hands shaking as she held the cutlery. Ethan froze, eyes wide, mouth open, unresponsive. The restaurant continued in a low murmur around them, but at that table, the world was falling apart in slow motion. Michael saw in Emily's eyes the exact moment she realized she was trapped. He saw the panic, the guilt, the desperate attempt to find a way out. But there was no way out. No more. And then, everything that was hidden came to light. Emily looked at Michael, and he realized that this would be the moment his life would change forever. Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Claire's words still hung in the air, sharp, cutting, like invisible blades digging into her skin. The restaurant, once a scene of normality and false appearances, now became a battlefield where no lie could survive. The silence that followed was so deafening that she felt her own heart beating in her throat. Michael sat next to him, motionless, his expression unreadable. His eyes, which for so many years had been her safe haven, were now just empty, cold wells, filled with something she couldn't face. Claire, on the other side of the table, was holding her wine glass so tightly she looked like she was about to shatter it. And Ethan. Ethan looked like a man on the verge of collapse, unable to find a single word that could justify what he had done. Emily opened her mouth, but no explanation seemed sufficient. She saw the raw disappointment on Michael's face, the silent anger, the absolute control he exerted over himself to not explode there, in the middle of everyone. Ethan, in turn, looked away, unable to look at Claire, as if he still harbored the illusion that if he didn't look directly, he wouldn't have to face the truth. Claire broke the silence first. His voice was low, shaky, but each word carried a weight that could not be ignored. "How could you do that? How could they look at us, sleep next to us, pretend that everything was fine?" Ethan finally looked up, his expression a mix of shame and despair. "Claire, no," she raised her hand, interrupting any attempt at justification. "You have no right to speak. I just want to know," she swallowed hard, trying to control the tears that threatened to escape. Was it just an adventure? Or was it something more?" Emily felt Claire's gaze boring into her and, as much as she wanted to look away, she knew she couldn't. He knew he had nowhere else to run. His throat was dry, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts that were going nowhere. "Claire, answer me. Was it just desire or was it love?" Emily blinked rapidly, feeling the words weigh like lead inside her. He felt Ethan move beside him, hesitantly, as if he was also waiting for the answer. She took a deep breath, chest tight, and realized that anything she said would only make everything worse. I don't know. Claire let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Don't you know? So you destroyed 2 marriages and you don't know why? Emily looked down, feeling the crushing weight of guilt on her shoulders. She wanted to say that it was never her intention, that things got out of control, that she herself got lost in something that she didn't know how to stop. But saying it now wouldn't change anything. Michael finally moved. His voice was low, controlled, but carried with something that made Emily shiver. Did you even think about me? Ever? She turned her face to him, her eyes feeling teary, but he didn't seem shaken. He looked exhausted. As if everything inside him had already died before that conversation even started. Michael, no. Don't do that. Don't give me explanations that you don't believe yourself. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the tears. He knew her too well. He knew when she was lying, knew when she was trying to soften the truth to minimize the pain. But there was no minimizing that. I just wanted to, she tried, but her voice broke. Michael let out a dry, humorless laugh. What did you want, Emily? Emotion? A little adrenaline? Or simply something I couldn't give you? She clasped her hands in her lap, the lump in her throat growing. It wasn't about that, then tell me. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower, colder. Why was it? Emily looked at Ethan for a moment, and that small gesture was enough to make Michael sit back in his chair, as if he'd been hit with an invisible punch. Claire stood up suddenly, the sound of the chair scraping across the floor echoing through the restaurant. His eyes were shining with unshed tears, but his voice was firm. I'm not going to sit here and listen to you try to justify this. I don't need to hear explanations from a man who destroyed our marriage. Ethan also stood up, but Claire took a step back, as if any proximity to him was an insult. Claire, please. She let out a short, almost hysterical laugh. Do you want me to forgive you? Do you want me to forget? I just want you to listen to me, I've heard enough. She turned to Emily, and this time her voice was filled with pain, with something irreversible. You were my best friend. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the hot tear run down her cheek. I know. Claire shook her head slowly, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. But now you are nothing to me. Emily felt it like a knife in the chest. She wanted to say something, anything, but Claire was already leaving, walking away, leaving behind what had once been a solid friendship and was now nothing more than rubble. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but followed Claire, calling out to her, trying desperately to keep everything from falling apart even further. Michael remained seated. Just staring at Emily. So that's it? His voice was low, tired. She looked at him, but he looked away first, as if he couldn't bear to see her anymore. I don't know what to say. He laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. Neither do I. Emily wanted to beg, wanted to say that everything was a mistake, that nothing that happened was bigger than what they built. But there was something about Michael that stopped her. He wasn't furious. He didn't want to scream. He just looked, finished. He slowly got up, picked up his wallet and threw some bills on the table. I'm leaving. Her heart raced. Michael, you made your choice, Emily. Now I'm going to do mine. And then he turned and left, without looking back. Emily stood there, alone, surrounded by untouched dishes, discreet glances from strangers, a table that now seemed cold, empty, a perfect reflection of what was left of her life. And for the first time since it all started, she realized she had lost everything. Michael didn't come home that night. He drove aimlessly, his mind still boiling, his thoughts running over each other in a whirlwind of emotions that seemed to have no end. The silence inside the car was almost unbearable, but he couldn't turn on the radio, he couldn't allow any external noise to drown out the only truth that now echoed like a scream inside him. Emily betrayed him. She not only deceived him, but she did it with someone he trusted, someone who was part of the inner circle of his life. He had been humiliated in a way he never imagined possible. Everything he had built, everything he believed to be solid, was now just a pile of rubble scattered before his eyes. When he finally stopped the car, he realized he was in front of a hotel. Without thinking, he went in and asked for a room. It wasn't a luxurious place, but it wasn't decadent either. Just a space where he could close the door and allow himself to feel everything he was repressing. As soon as he locked the door behind him, he sank onto the bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. For hours, he remained there, without sleeping, without even being able to close his eyes for long. Deep down, I knew there was no going back. Emily made her choice and he needed to make his. The next morning, his decision was made. He called a lawyer, started the divorce process and organized his belongings to leave the house. Emily tried to talk to him a few times, but he didn't respond. There was a limit to what she could take, and at that moment, any words from her would only widen the wound that was still bleeding. Emily, on the other hand, was wallowing in her own destruction. Since the night of the dinner, his life has become a sequence of undeniable failures. Claire didn't want to see her or hear her name, and the loss of that friendship hit her in a way she didn't expect. The look of contempt, the voice full of pain, the words that made it clear that she no longer meant anything, all of this crushed her more than anything. And then there was Michael, the man she shared a lifetime with, the one who had always been by her side, the one who had never done anything to deserve what she did. He didn't scream, he didn't argue, he didn't beg for explanations. He just left, and that absence hurt more than any confrontation. Time passed, but Emily was unable to escape the consequences of her actions. Guilt gnawed at her daily, and no matter how much she tried to move on, there was always something that pulled her back to that night, to the moment she lost everything. The marriage ended quickly, without major conflicts. Michael didn't want to prolong the suffering and made sure every detail was resolved as straightforwardly as possible. He sold the house, divided the assets and moved on with his life without looking back. Ethan wasn't so lucky. Unlike Emily, who was plunged into regret, he desperately tried to repair the damage he caused. He sought out Claire, tried to redeem himself, made promises that previously sounded empty, even to him. But Claire wasn't the kind of woman who accepted being made a fool of. She gave him no room for justifications or excuses. She took everything she was owed in the divorce, without remorse, and disappeared from his life without a trace. Ethan, who had gotten used to having everything under control, now found himself alone, without a wife, without stability, and, more than that, without anyone's respect. His name became a whisper in the hallways at work, a weight that crushed him every day. Little by little, he realized that the betrayal not only destroyed his marital life, but also collapsed his career. Michael, in turn, found a new beginning. After months away from the chaos that his life had become, he found something he thought he had lost forever: peace. The divorce was finalized, the painful memories were left behind and, little by little, he began to breathe again without feeling the crushing weight of betrayal. He met someone else, someone who didn't carry shadows, who didn't have dubious intentions. It was a slow, cautious process, but it made him realize that there was still room for love and happiness, even after so much destruction. Emily saw him one last time, by chance, in a cafe they used to frequent. He was in company, smiling in a way she hadn't seen in a long time. She didn't come any closer. He just watched from a distance, feeling the impact of what he had lost. At that moment, she realized that Michael had moved on, and that, unlike her, he had found a way to rebuild his life without carrying the ghosts of the past. Betrayal destroyed 2 marriages, but the consequences went further. Ethan has lost everything he took for granted. Claire found her own freedom, away from a relationship tainted by lies. Michael rose from the ashes, proving that fidelity and loyalty would always be worth more than any momentary temptation. And Emily. Emily was left behind, trapped in her own choices, living with the weight of knowing she risked everything for something that was never worth it. Now, tell me, what did you think of this story? Do you believe that betrayal always leads to inevitable consequences? Leave your opinion in the comments and share your reflections on this outcome. If you liked this impactful narrative, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more shocking stories like this. And remember, here, we do not support cheating. We always choose truth, loyalty and respect. Until next time.